Welcome, everyone. We really appreciate you taking your time to join us for today's webinar. We're going to do everything we can to be informative and to use your time wisely. So we're going to go ahead and get started now. Next slide, please, Stuart. Quick, brief introductions again. I want to make sure everyone knows how, who's addressing you and how to get in touch with us. A couple points about managing the webinar and asking questions. Then we're going to jump into an overview, a summary really of what business needs multi-echelon addresses. We're going to talk broadly in that way, and then we're going to dig into the weeds a little bit, talk about some of the screens and some of the best practices. And then, of course, we'll have Stuart walk through the application to highlight some of the high points also. By all means, ask any of us questions. I'll show you in a minute the user interface, but we encourage questions during the session, and there's a Q&A area in your application, your user interface for you to do so. I'm Jeff. Stuart will be leading the live demo portion. Janine, Linda, and Megan are here to support us with covering some material and help answer your questions. Please do take a moment to look at your Zoom meeting user interface. There is that Q&A section where you can ask us questions during our material, and we certainly encourage it. And of course, your main customer service consultant can follow up with you on any additional questions you may have after the fact also. So do not hesitate to reach out to us. Next slide. This webinar will be recorded, as they all have been. There's a new section on the support site where these webinars will be found. If you go to Solutions and look for Softvision Suite Educational Webinars, you'll find them. It's a good way to grab tidbits out of these for future reference, and highly encourage you to use them. So let's jump right in. I know that some of you have multi-echelon. I know that some of you are curious about it. Just like all of our customers across all of our modules, the specific reasons to have it and how it's configured can vary tremendously. So what you're looking for in this presentation are the concepts that can help you maximize your use of it, or the concepts of business issues that you have in your building where multi-echelon may be an option to help solve some of those problems. The real focus is, how are some of our current customers using multi-echelon? And some of those examples include, the East Coast, West Coast distribution center model. Multi-echelon supports that well. Retail stores, understanding what they have, what they need, and managing their inventory position is a great use of multi-echelon. Fulfillment by Amazon. More and more of our customers are using that as a sales marketing channel, and that requires understanding inventory position in yet another location. There's a theme here, multiple inventory locations. Vendor-owned merchandise. You want to see on-hand location of others. We can support that. Another recent trend for a couple of our customers, and more are discussing it, is virtual inventory or allocated inventory for certain sales channels where they don't want one sales channel to consume all the goods. They want to hold inventory for a sales channel. They don't want it to disappear through other channels. Wholesale branches, similar in some ways to retail, but not exactly. How do I replenish remote locations of business-to-business contacts? So again, the focus is multiple locations, and how do we support that? Janine's going to speak now about some of the setup considerations for multi-echelon.
So with any implementation of a module that you take on, we do have to have conversations around how we're going to set up or prep for this new module. So some of the key things that we talk about in relation to multi-echelon is where are your demand requirements going to be for each of these locations. So we give you the ability to look at your order transactional history. It'll show you, based on whether East Coast, West Coast scenario, if you've got retail stores, what that demand looked like in the past so that you can start creating that future view. For those that don't necessarily or haven't necessarily worked in that world, managing it outside of a system, we obviously give you the opportunity to make assumptions for the future business as to where that demand will come from. We also need to know how much inventory you're going to have in each location. So we give you different methods to handle transfers. We give you the option to protect inventory in locations so that you're not depleting your main warehouse, for example, or a key store. You want to always make sure gets the product first. So we give you opportunity and flexibility in there. We also want to figure out how you're going to move this inventory. Are we going to be supplying certain locations by vendor purchase orders? And which locations are we going to have supported by one of the warehouses in the echelon hierarchy? And then most importantly, we need to know what product you want inventoried where. So one of the additions to the interfaces for multi-echelon is an item master warehouse record. You'll hear us saying IMWH record quite a bit, but this is what tells us what SKUs you have inventoried in any of the locations that you have in your multi-echelon setup. Next slide, please. So we do have some admin setup requirements. So we have to define those echelons. And the echelons we refer to as typically the main distribution center, if you've got regional distribution centers and retail stores or those virtual warehouse locations that Jeff mentioned. With the 1901 version, we give you a little bit of flexibility with the direction of the flow of inventory with these echelons. We then have to set up the actual warehouses and locations to define them. With the warehouses then set up, we have rules for allocating demand for each of those locations, and we need you to set those. And then the default of how are we going to replenish. So we have fill priority rules that determine your primary, your secondary, and potentially tertiary supplier for these warehouses.
Hey, Janine. Megan here. We had a question come in related to that last slide you were discussing.
Okay.
The question is, are there additional interfaces to support ME?
There isn't any additional interfaces other than the inclusion of that IMWH record that we interface. There is a file that is required to export out of the database, which would be to support the transfer orders. So similar to how you extract requisitions or actions today, we would now have an additional file that would contain the transfer orders that we would then feed to your host system.
And the IMWH is in the IP file, which you're all already sending us. So you need to tweak it, but it's not additional per se. Thank you, Megan, for that.
Great, thank you.
So let me reinforce a little bit of what Janine mentioned earlier, and that is that multi-echelon is hierarchical. During setup, we need to give real consideration to what is the center hub of what effectively becomes the spoke locations. where is this regional distribution center predominantly replenished from? It's the main DC. And then you'll hear Linda and Stuart talk later about, secondary and tertiary replenishment paths also. So predominantly, R1 is replenished by the DC, but secondarily, we may have it replenished by the vendor. The DC is predominantly replenished by the vendor. So that hierarchical nature is important to set up. And we've recently added functionality to see between same level hierarchies. So with multi-echelon, you got a lot of new vocabulary also, vocabulary and concepts, and it's really important to work through all that with us. So Linda, why don't you walk through a couple screens that they're going to be exposed to or that they use today and just reinforce some of the concepts in those screens, please.
Sure. So as Janine mentioned, the warehouse default fill priority tab is a required tab when setting up multi-echelon for all our locations. It provides the base rules for replenishment for each location and how that will be sourced and managed. So Stuart, you want to head to the next slide? So the fields and the options to set up and manage the warehouse defaults priority screen are our most frequently asked questions, both at the time of setup, but also later during any fine-tuning sessions as you work with your CSV. For this reason, we've added a slide in here that basically includes a definition or a purpose for the fields that we use. So Janine talked about protecting inventory. So protect inventory. If we have a location that is used to fill its own demand or orders for customers, but that location is also available to transfer inventory to other locations, you may want to protect the demand so the lower transfer warehouses or stores don't run out of inventory or steal all the inventory for that warehouse to be able to fulfill its own customer orders. So all you need to do is assign a percent of the demand that you want to protect. The next field, which is protection method, basically is saying how long do you want us to protect that inventory. So if you set aside a certain percentage to protect, we need to know how long to look out for that. So we give two options. The first is basically receipt, and we always, with receipt, say we're going to look from the current week until the next receipt that's scheduled to come in. That could be a requisition, it could be an action item, it could be a transfer. We just go looking for that next receipt of inventory. In the event that there is no receipt, then what do we look for? So that is where we offer a secondary option called receipt lead time. And in this instance, we'll look out one lead time or until when the next receipt is scheduled to come in. Receipt lead time is probably the most common method we see used when we first set up the fill priority screen, and then you determine as you're looking at seasonality of product and going in and out if you ever want to change that. So your next field is allocation priority. So if you have, say, multiple stores that are being fulfilled from a warehouse, you have the option that you can prioritize one of these stores. So in the event there's insufficient inventory to fill all transfers, we will make sure to fill that priority transfer first, and then any remaining inventory will be split across the other warehouses based off of the transfer mix percent of what is needed. So supplier type is basically telling us where is the inventory supplied from. Is it going to come from somewhere else, some other echelon level that you've set up, or is it going to come from the vendor? And then what is the lead time? If it is going to be supplied from another warehouse or echelon location, how many days to fill, ship, receive that transfer at your receiving warehouse or store? Real key with this is this lead time is entered in days. So just in the event that materials planning, you're using weeks, you want to make sure when setting this up that it is done in days. So the supplier type, the lead time, those all have to be completed for your primary supplying option. So we talked about primary, secondary, tertiary. So in the event that a product may not be stocked in your supplying warehouse, and again, we look to the IMWH record to see if that product is stocked at that location, we'll go looking to the secondary or the tertiary. So you can set up the warehouse default screen to manage at that high level hierarchy within, warehouse, store, virtual warehouse. You can change and allocate that down within your category or subcategory level. But then we also use the IMWH record to keep track of those products that may or may not be stocked within your location. So the warehouse default screen also, thank you, Stuart, also offers your option as how are you going to manage the replenishment from those higher echelon locations down to your child locations or transfer to locations. And so the most common method that we are seeing now with all our clients is weeks of supply. It is very easy to set up, it's very clean, it's very easy to understand. There are basically two parameters. You tell us how many weeks of inventory do you want to maintain at that child location or transfer to location. So if you're a store, you can say how many weeks of supply do you need to have. And your second parameter is just basically how many weeks of demand do you want to roll up to order from the vendor. And most clients typically set that up to be their planning horizon. The second most common method we see is reorder point. And this is where we offer min and max ordering capability. So minimum would be, what is the minimum you want to fall down to before placing or another transfer order to be set up? And then we use the max capability to say, okay, what are we gonna order up to, whether it be a level or amount. And the third option that's offered with transfers is economic order quantity or EOQ. And in this instance, you tell us two parameters that will then be, will calculate the transfer quantity based off of an algorithm. So the order cost is typically what is your cost of placing the order, doing the analysis, validating forecast accuracy, issuing the rec, should it include EDI costs? All of that is information you determine that you want to include in the ordering cost. The second parameter is holding cost. And so that is what is the percent of the product or SKU cost of this product to store and hold and any fill orders for this product code. We typically see EOQ used on products where you have a high bulk storage rate, so a high cube product where you may have to go out and rent ancillary storage space, or you may be only able to store 1 or 2 units in a pick bin. And that's where economic order quantity comes in. So with that, unless we have any questions, I'm going to turn it over to Stuart, who's going to go through some of the screens and do our live demo.
Thank you, Linda. And Stuart's going to join us in a second. I just want to remind everyone to type out questions if you're feeling the urge, or at least make sure to follow up with us on any you might have later. So, Stuart, you're on.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Linda. So I'm in a sample dashboard, and I'm going to go through the different setups in administration, and then go into the transfer hot list, transfer order review, and creating transfers. So the first thing in administration is to set up these echelon types. And this is the different types that you would set up. In this example, this first one is warehouse. So that's a WH, and we call that warehouse. That's the first level. Typically, our supplier would be the vendor. The second level we have set up is stores. So in this case, we'd be transferring from warehouse to stores. Now, you might have this set up differently. You might have it set up as a CDC at the first level, or maybe a regional warehouse is level 2, and then auxiliary warehouse is level 3, or remote warehouse. So this will depend on the business setup, but this is basically where you first come to set up these different levels and types. Next thing we set up is the warehouse itself. So here you see we have this first warehouse, the CDC. the primary supplier type is vendor. Some of these others, like the store, Denver, the supplier type here is warehouse, and the supplier is O1 or the CDC. And we put in here the lead time, and we put that in days. So this would take 11 days. We also could set up a secondary supplier. Again, you could change these. You could change this to vendor and have this warehouse come from the vendor, or you could have it come from another store. So we recently changed this so you could set up any supplier you want for any of these different locations, and it could go back and forth to each of the levels. So this is where you would set up all of your warehouses. You would set up, if you have Amazon, let's say here, or a virtual warehouse, you would set up all of these here in warehouse. Then we go into warehouse defaults. And here you see our levels. There's warehouse and store. I'm going to go to fill priority. So here you see this is our warehouses set up, the CDC and a warehouse 2, and these are our different stores. And you could see here, this actually is a duplicate of what you set up in the warehouse setting. So whether you set it up here or there, it's going to copy that information back and forth. So here's the supplier types and the supplier and the lead time. And then there's secondary and tertiary if you set that up. Here we set up the protected inventory. So we want to keep a certain percent, and it could be any percent up to 100% of the demand for the main warehouse so that we're not transferring out and maybe causing back orders. So in this case, we're protecting 80% of that demand until the next receipt, or if there isn't a receipt, to lead time. And again, you have that option to either receipt or receipt lead time. There's also allocation priority. So if you set one of these to true, let's say, then if you only have enough inventory to transfer, this warehouse is going to get first dibs on it, basically. We're going to look at the needs for that warehouse, and we're going to allocate that first before going to these others.
And dibs is a technical term, right, Stuart?
Dibs is a technical term, yes.
All right, just want to make sure.
Yeah, depending on your merchandise. Okay, we also, once we set up our full priority, we have to set up our transfer order method. Okay, so this is the method to set up suggested transfers. And it's in this ROP tab, and you could set up any of these methods: weeks of supply, or EOQ, or ROP. So if you set this up for weeks of supply, you would go to the weeks of supply tab, and this is where you would set up. So in this case for Denver, we're going to cover 4 weeks for a 2-week period. So it'll cover week 1 to 4 and then 2 to 5. Here you're going to have 5 weeks across the entire, let's say 22 weeks, which may be the entire horizon. Okay, on any of these, you could go down here and set it differently for different categories or subcategories or even products. Typically, you would set it up here at the top warehouse level, but you could change it. You could change the method. Economic order quantity is where we would set up our order cost and our holding cost. And Linda spoke about that before. So the system would look at both of these parameters and settings to determine whether we're gonna suggest a transfer or not. Okay, reorder points you would set right in here. Typically, you wouldn't do it at a warehouse level. You might do it at a subcategory or a product level, and these would be for products that you want to make sure that you have enough inventory. Your demand might be sporadic, or actually maybe have no demand during a certain time period or seasonality. These could be expensive items or these could be cheap items. So your choice here is to go amount or level. If I go to level, in this case it's saying once I get down to 0, order 1 or order 3 or whatever you set this to. So once you get down to 0, the suggested transfer would be 3. You could do it by amount, and in that case, once you get down to 0, it will order whatever you put in here.
So this is kind of following along the lines of min-max, Stuart, is that right?
That's correct.
And we found this has worked great for people that, to Stuart's point, exceptionally expensive item, regardless of the forecast. Always keep one, but only one on the shelf. Might be an example. Another example where we see people using this is web-only items. You know, there's an initiative in the building to put a lot of web-only items online. And they're difficult to forecast. So put a case or half a dozen on the shelf, and when I get down to 3, prompt me to get 6 more. And that prompt might lead you to reevaluate, you know, the sales over the period of time to decide if, you know, 6 is the right number or not. But at least it keeps it in front of you and makes you evaluate that.
That's correct. And also, like I said, with demand, you might not have demand coming through for the product, or it may be sporadic, but you still want to have that inventory. All right, so that's the basic setup in warehouse defaults. And I'm not going to save changes here. So we set up our echelon types, we set up our warehouse, we set up warehouse defaults, and now I'm going to company warehouse allocation. So the allocation is where you're going to allocate the demand or forecast from products into the different warehouses. So if you're in PLF or anywhere, you're forecasting a product, you don't have to forecast for each of those warehouses. This warehouse allocation will set it up for you. And these are the different allocation sets that we have set up. You usually need to set up a default allocation set. Okay, and default allocation means that if there's no assigned source listed in offer setup, and that's where you would do it, that it will use this default allocation. So normally, if you want to specify a specific offer for a different allocation, you would go into offer setup, and in the miscellaneous tab, there's an allocation set, and you could enter it there. But here we see the default allocation. So here you could see, here's the allocation by date. The current allocation for warehouse 1 is 93%, and these other ones are the smaller 1.74%. Okay, so current is whatever's current. You could add an allocation to begin at a certain point or a certain date and update that allocation. You see the history down here. So the history will show you that different breakdown. Now, if you wanted to, you could add an allocation. And I would pick a date. Let's say I'd pick the end of October. And I could go down here, uncheck, and see what the history is for like the fourth quarter. So I could go down and check November or October or December, and then see if the allocation's different. And it might be different during that certain time period. So if I click here, I could copy historical. So now I have a different allocation set. So once we get to this date, the system is going to break up the demand and the forecast by these different allocations. You could copy from history. I'm sorry, Jeff, let me just make one thing. Copy from history, or you could actually manually add this in here.
I just wanted to reinforce a couple concepts here, Stuart. So the future allocation, another use for this that is interesting, is the opening of another warehouse or the opening of another store into the future. So I want my demand to begin being pushed to that new location beginning this date is another concept that would work. And to Stuart's point, seasonality could be one also.
Right. So if this is a new warehouse that you don't have history for, you could just enter a percent in here and then normalize the other percents. I'm going to go to a different allocation set. I'm not going to save this for now. So here you see this Irvine allocation set. Here we have specific sources. So we went into offer setup and said, these offers, we want specifically to use this allocation. And here we have it as 100% to 8B. Now, maybe as an example, you could have this as your Amazon offers, and then it'll all go to this Amazon location, or a virtual warehouse. You may want these specific offers to go to this virtual warehouse, and you would set it up that way. So that's why you set up these different allocation sets. The other thing you could do is set up product groups. So if you have groups of products that you want a different allocation for, you could create a new product group. So this one's long sleeve shirt, I could link to this product group maintenance. And this is where you could create new product groups. This is a menu item, but you could get to it and link to it from this allocation. So these 4 shirts are in that. I went in and I did this search. I could do this by category or subcategory. I could do it by description in this case, because these products might sell differently. So because of the different sales, I would go in there and I would create these product groups and set a different allocation. You have the choice to see all of them or the ones in the group, which is in blue, or not in group. So as you get new items, you may want to go in there and add them to this group. And so this new item would then get this allocation. So this product group has this allocation set up, pretty much 25%, and it's going to use that allocation instead of the company allocation or anything at the company level. Okay? And if we went to that product, you'd see that it would be inherited from the product group. So it's going to override that. As you go in here also, you might see, as you expand this, some of these are highlighted. It means that there's some product here which would be set with a different allocation. So it lets you know that. And you could set the different allocation for the product. And you could also link from PLF or from materials planning to that allocation. But in summary, you would go in, you would set up your default allocation, and then you would go in and set up these other different allocation sets.
I just wanted to add real quick where the product groups come in handy as well is if you have the scenario of East Coast, West Coast, or you have retail stores that are in more in the South than in the North or things like that, you will get different performance in products based on location. So short sleeves are obviously going to have a longer sell-through period in the southern locations than they would the north or east versus west. So it gives you that option to allocate your demand differently than the overall company level allocation. So I just want to throw that in there.
No, that's a good point, because you would have different sales by these different categories and locations.
It's also good for themed type product as well. So if you've got Halloween, where you've got products that cross over multiple categories, but they have a really short sell-through period, or Mother's Day or Valentine's Day or things like that, product groups would be another way to potentially manage that.
And that's why we have this product description as a filter, which is good, because you're right, things could be across different categories or subcategories. So here you could either do one or the other, or you could just put in that description, which is good. All right, any questions on the allocation or other setups? Because I'm now going to go into the transfer hot list. So once we've done our setup, we go in to take a look at the different transfers. So in master scheduling, we have a transfer hot list. You put in a supplier and a destination, and I hit retrieve. All right, now you have a choice here to bring up ones that have allocated quantity or show zero quantity. And you might want to also review those zero quantities. The reason you might have that is because you don't have enough inventory in your supplying warehouse. So those are things you might want to review. But just to make it a little bit shorter, I'm just going to bring in this allocated quantity. There is a parameter that will determine whether this is separated by scheduler or not. So basically, here we have the parameters. So each of these different schedulers would go in and handle their own transfers. If you turn that off, then basically scheduler field is not here. And you would have, let's say, one person that's handling the transfers, one or more. So if we expand this, I could see all the different SKUs that are here. Here's a suggested transfer quantity, 783. I see the on-hand quantity, and then the allocated quantity. So I could go in there and take a look and see, in some cases, I'm getting the allocated quantity because I have enough on hand. Here, I'm only getting 100, so I'm getting less than that. Now, you could go in and create your transfers directly here if I go in to do it. But a lot of people like to review it more and basically go into transfer order review. So that way you get a better view. And you could do some more filtering and sorting and other checking. I didn't want to do that. There we go, transfer order review. All right, so there's a lot of different sections to here, to this screen. Since we linked from the hot list, it filled in this information. If you went straight to transfer order review, you would just fill this information in. Here I said, just show me allocated quantity. There's other options in here. Setting the lines per transfer. Splitting by brands, if you interface brands, some companies do that. And there's also a lot of different columns here, which you could go in and you could customize the different columns that are available. Now, notice that we have these two transfers. So here we have this first one that'll give us an order by date and expected date, and it'll show us the total units, total cost, weight, and if you have, cube set up and you have these parameters set up, it'll show you the container and truck percents. So the reason why we have these two transfers is most of the products here in this warehouse is set up for weeks of supply. So you see here, we're going 4 weeks of supply for 2 weeks. And I'll link to materials planning and show you some examples of how that's working. You could see also here that you could set it up differently for different categories or subcategories. So one other thing you could do here is we could do some sorting. So I may want to sort by total units, descending. So I want to look at my larger transfers. Okay, so here's our total units. Here's the method that we have. You could also go in here and filter. So if I wanted to get rid of, I don't want to see any transfer with 1 or null, I could hit apply, and anything you filter will change what's on top here, what's going to be in the transfer. Oh, here, let's take a look at this one. Here's this bucket seat. I could double click and go into materials planning. So let's take a look and see the suggested transfers. The allocated units will copy into this what if you're linking directly from transfer order review or the transfer hot list. And so that way you could create the transfer. So our what if here, or allocated units, is 783. That's covering us for the next 4 weeks. The second, 58, is covering for the next 4 weeks. So we're covered here through week 7. For any of these, if you right-click, you could see the allocated transfer details, not only for this warehouse, but for all the different warehouses that have this supplier. So our total need is 1228, which is this allocated quantity, right? Here's your suggested quantity. Our quantity on hand is 2502. We're protecting 505. That was a protected percent. We're protecting the demand in warehouse 01 to make sure we don't send those out. So our available to transfer is 1997, priority and non-priority. So we'll go in and allocate these quantities and put those on the transfer. It's the same true of this one. Let me go back to another example. Here's this carpenter's pencil. So in this case, you could see 3909. Our units that we need is 8352. If I right click, I could see my allocation. The total destination need is 24301. That's these suggested quantities. My on hand in warehouse 1 is 20,009. I'm protecting 80% of that demand. So my priority available to transfer is 14,892. So in that case, since warehouse B, 8B, has a true allocation priority, we're going to allocate 100%. So this warehouse is getting what it needs from the available, this priority. And then once we take this away, this is how much we have left for the other warehouses. And it's going to split it based on this allocation percent. So here's a suggested quantity, and that's 52% of the needs, and here's another. So we're allocating less than our needs, but it's allocating it based on the percent. So this is where this allocation priority comes into play, where you don't have enough basically for all of your warehouses. That's also where protected comes into play, where you want to protect that. Without that, we would have transferred out more of these. On the second one, you could see the allocated transfer details. We need more of that, 1544, but there's nothing on hand. We basically have to wait for the next receipt. All right, let me go back to the hot lists. Again, you could go in there and you could filter this by the different fields. If I want to look at ROP, here's one that we set for reorder point. We have our 3 units because that's set for reorder point. Or you could select them all. All right, now once we're ready, we go in there, we reviewed it, we want to create the transfer order. So I could go up here and I could either check one or check all. If you had a bunch of these, you could determine which ones you want to create and go to create transfer order. And here it's going to show you this top header information. You have a ship and expected date. And then you have the different individual SKUs, suggested quantity, allocated, and transfer. And if you wanted to, you could make changes in here. You could also go in, if you know the cost is different, and adjust that there. And once you finish this one, you could do a validate and save, validate and hold, and then move to the next one if you wanted to. But in this case, I'm not going to create the transfer. Okay, so once you have these transfers, you could go to transfer order lookup. So now I could look up my open transfers. I hit the wrong one. Give me a second. There we go. So you could see your open or your transfers on hold. So these are the transfers that are due to come in and go out from this supplier to the destination. You could double click and review what's there. You could close it, or once it comes in, it'll close. You know, you'd be sending that in our POS records, basically. And I just want to show you how that looks if I put in a particular product here and where you see that transfer information. So here in Warehouse 1, you can see here we transferred out 336, and that's going into this 8A location. Here's the transfer coming in, and it's going to ship the demand for that week. If you double click, you could see the transfer information in here. All right, that's it. Are there questions?
Stuart, we'll ask a couple at the end that I've seen pop up, but why don't you let Janine walk through her next slide. Really appreciate that overview. Thank you.
Yeah, great job, Stuart. A lot of information. All right, so with each of our modules, we do have a best practices template. This is often shared early on in the implementation, and it tends to mean more once you've actually implemented and have this as a reference. It's typically a 1 to 2 page sheet that's your go-to. So the purpose of the best practices is to give you a real quick look at what tasks and goals you're trying to accomplish with that specific module. We guide you through the screens that you need to address and the key function that typically needs to be decided on or addressed in these best practices. But most importantly, we indicate those activities that you do at the implementation, and what ends up happening is people tend to maybe not pay attention, or they kind of forget what their settings were initially. And so we recommend this too, even with your configuration parameters. You do want to come back and take a look at these different tasks and different settings to make sure that the timing that you established when we've looked at this best practices still makes sense for your business. You also want to see if some of the settings still make sense. You will typically find that the more time you are working with the module, that certain settings you want to dial in more to help manage the business a bit more efficiently for you. So we do have these. If you need these for this module and or any of the others, just reach out to any of us on the CSC team and we'll get them to you and we'll help you refine these if you need them. But they are a really good quick go-to reminder of all of the things that impact the specific module that you're working with.
Thank you, Janine. So, summary, what is multi-echelon? It allows you to take your forecasts for an event, a period, a book, a channel, whatever the plan is, and then distribute, apply, or allocate this forecast to multiple locations. For my outdoor furniture spring business, I want to fulfill 60% of the demand from my East Coast DC and 40% from my West Coast DC. So as I'm building POs, I can ship goods to each of those to those proportions. Might be an example. It lets you see then the inventory position in those locations. So Stuart was in materials planning, which we're all familiar with. Well, it lets the planner see broadly where their goods are and where their goods need to be across multiple locations. And you saw Stuart in transfer order review. That supports moving goods between and through the echelons. It initiates a transfer order. Very similar look and feel to our suggested purchase order module, which if you're familiar with, but is also included in multi-echelon. So we have suggested purchase orders and suggested transfer orders as an element of multi-echelon. A couple more wrapping comments by Linda, and then I do have a couple questions I want to get out there that I've seen.
So we're sometimes asked, what's the difference between your multi-echelon module and your multi-warehouse module? First thing to know is multi-warehouse is included with multi-echelon, so you do get both. So with multi-warehouse, we give you just the ability to allocate forecast demand to multiple locations, and then you can see a different inventory position by each of those locations. That's the cumulative total of what you see with multi-warehouse. With multi-echelon, we add in the ability to automate those transfers and replenishment capabilities. So we help maximize your resources in managing that inventory so you can spend more time on forecasting. And the same multi-echelon includes that suggested purchase order module that Jeff just talked about. So we'll roll up your purchases, transfer needs up to your warehouses, and then your purchase needs from the vendor to each of those warehouses, depending on how you choose to replenish it. So that's basically the two. Multi-echelon is giving you some automated capability, allowing you to spend more time on forecast accuracy and analysis, where multi-warehouse is primarily just giving you the differences to allocate demand separately and to see that inventory position. But all the work is being managed by the users.
Thank you, Linda. So yeah, the great thing about multi-echelon is that it lets you see it like you do in MW, but it also then lets you do something about it or with it, right? So here's a question, Stuart, I'd like you to take on for us. Can you reserve or protect inventory so that a warehouse doesn't get depleted? I know you covered that in concepts, but just discuss it a little bit more on how or if and how we're able to protect inventory.
So I can hop in, Jeff.
Okay.
So on that warehouse default screen on the Fill Priority tab, you have the ability, it's called Protect Inventory. And so you can go in, if a warehouse is fulfilling customer orders and also transferring inventory to other locations, you want to protect that demand or inventory that's used to fulfill that demand for that warehouse. And you sign a certain percentage of that warehouse demand to say, I want to protect 100% of my customer demand from this warehouse, or I only want to protect 50%. And then you tell us the length of time that you want to protect that inventory, whether it be until the next receipt or whether it be either lead time to source product from the vendor or until that next receipt, whichever. So
yeah, thanks, Linda. One thing I want to add is the assumption is your next receipt should cover you, and that's why we protect until that receipt. It usually should, but that's the logic that's used. That next receipt that's coming in should cover your demand. So until that comes in, we protect that inventory.
And then another way to handle this similarly but different is that concept of a virtual warehouse, where we'll actually move goods from that main DC out of it and into another inventory bucket. So you're protecting downstream in that case. You're protecting a sales channel's needs by taking it away from the main distribution center. So there's a couple different ways to approach it, which is kind of cool. One last question. How does multi-echelon facilitate fulfillment by Amazon in regards to the forecasts? I've got some ideas. Anyone else want to tackle that one? It really boils down to managing FBA, or fulfillment by Amazon, as its own separate forecast bucket, which many of you do already. But then being able to take those forecasts and execute transfers out of your main distribution center to tell the warehouse what to physically pull and send to Amazon. So it's just another use of ME to see inventory in multiple locations and transfer it to them. It's not a whole lot different than planning for stores or planning for web only and needing to see the plan broken out into different inventory buckets.
So Jeff, a key with that is really work on your forecast accuracy, work on, validating you have the correct split by warehouses, but let the system do that roll up for you. You don't have to go through that day-to-day transfer step.
Exactly.
More time to work on that accuracy that's needed so much for sales.
So thank you once again, everyone, for participating. We'll get a follow-up email out to you with the link to the recording, and it will be posted to our support site under the Solutions tab as mentioned. And we'll have another invitation go out soon to cover Venture 21 Basics for our May webinar. And then we'll follow that up in June with Venture 21 102 or Beyond Basics afterwards. So again, thank you certainly Stuart, Linda, Janine, and Megan, and all of the participants for hanging in there with us today.